I just thought of a new idea, and maybe it'll save the United States of America, but who knows? So, we've got this problem right now where we started out with this thing called federalism. Federalism is the idea that we have a small federal government, and most of the functions of government are delegated to the states. In fact, the 10th Amendment to the United States Constitution says anything that is not expressly reserved for the federal government is automatically delegated down to the states. So originally, someone would be a citizen of, say, New York or California or Oregon before they were a citizen of the United States. Meaning you saw yourself as an Oregonian probably before you saw yourself as an American. But over time, we saw a significant expansion of the federal power, the federal government, the central government of the United States, and a corresponding diminishment of state powers. So that is useful in certain cases, such as providing for the common defense and making sure that we don't get invaded by China. However, in things like day-to-day affairs, questions of personal liberty and things of that nature, things like, say, the abortion debate or the debate over healthcare, these don't necessarily need to be federal issues, and one could argue that, well, the federal government is the only one that would have the resources to actually make any changes in these areas. But, well, they get those resources from ultimately the states and ultimately the people. And so if you want those things, then you should probably go to your own state government and pay the necessary taxes in order to make those things happen. And I'm not saying that these things are inherently good or inherently bad. I'm just saying that the way that we pay for them matters, and we should respect the will of the people. If the people of one state want to do something, we should let them do it. If the people of another state don't want to do something, we shouldn't force them to do it, and we shouldn't force them to pay for the people that do want to do it to essentially do it on their behalf, right? So the people of Arkansas, for example, who pay federal taxes, maybe those taxes shouldn't go towards things that are against their will, but that other states demanded that the federal government adopt. Perhaps those states should adopt those things themselves. Anyways, that's a basic rundown on federalism. It's the idea that the states should be the main people in charge of most things most of the time, and the federal government is very limited. So yeah, for many reasons throughout history, we've gotten away from that. We've gotten away from the limited role of the federal government, and we've seen a significant expansion of the federal budget, the federal deficit as well, and a significant expansion in the number of administrative agencies and executive branch agencies and policies from the federal government. So my plan is basically a return to federalism. And so essentially it's the idea that we should try to get back there, right? How do we get back to a limited federal government? And people have said this many times, and of course the question is, how do you actually make it work? So what I thought of is a few different policies that states that might want to try to make this work could adopt, and maybe encourage other similarly minded states to do so, operating at the state level and not the federal level. This is to say, I'm proposing state level policies that would align better with federalism and in fact create incentives that would lead other states to also want to adopt similar policies and ultimately lead to a smaller federal government and potentially more state government in its place. So, the policies that I thought of in order to try to get back to this Federalist system as originally envisioned, and by the way, if you haven't read the Federalist Papers, I would recommend them. They're a great read. These policies would largely involve creating economic incentives. So things like taxes and tariffs and things like that states might be able to try to create, and of course, do their best to see them put through and encourage other states to do the same. The first thing I would propose is that states would essentially discourage the federal government and federal employees and federal bureaucracy from building up in their state. So, for example, the state could impose a tax on any federal government employee that does not apply to to anyone else, right? So it kind of just discourages large numbers of federal government employees, administrative employees, people like that, federal government activity within particular states. I would also say that states should potentially impose a tariff on other states based on how much they contribute to the federal deficit. This is to say, the states that are taking the most money from the federal government without actually producing any value in return, meaning they are a net negative in terms of the federal deficit. For example, let's say I don't know, California, I would imagine probably doesn't contribute a positive number to, and I could be wrong. I'm just kind of thinking out loud here, honestly. But suppose California doesn't contribute very positively, and maybe they're actually one of the larger ones. I don't know, I'll use my own state, Oregon. Suppose Oregon actually doesn't contribute very positively to the federal balance sheet. Then a state that implements this proposal would essentially tariff any economic activity with Oregon according to basically how bad it is, right? So the more egregiously Oregon kind of mooches off of the federal system and consumes federal money and benefits from federal grants and doesn't fund things with their own state level taxes and has to rely on the Fed, then a state that implements my proposal would essentially need to tariff Oregon correspondingly. So states would start to earn revenue. Well, they would drive up their own prices, but essentially it would discourage economic activity with other states who are contributing negatively towards the federal deficit and things like that. Conversely, right, states could even subsidize economic activity with states who are actually producing more money than they are consuming from the federal government. So I know Texas is one example of a state that produces more than it actually takes away from the federal government, and so people would actually subsidize economic activity within with respect to a state like Texas, and so this encourages people to engage economically with states that are self-sufficient and who actually raise their own money, and removes the need to rely on the federal government for all of their economic kind of activity. So that way the federal government isn't in this position as much where they are funding everything for everyone. And at the same time, I would imagine that these taxes, which apply specifically to federal government activities, would serve to discourage those activities. And so that's the main components of this plan that I've thought of, the Return to Federalism plan, which would essentially create economic incentives via taxes on specific things, subsidies, and tariffs, in accordance with how well states' economies are doing with respect to needing to be subsidized by the federal government. And the final thing is that if states earn a surplus of revenue from these new incentives, then essentially what they could do is use that additional revenue to actually fund a rebate on all of their citizens' federal taxes. So suppose that a state earns $10 million from this plan, and the citizens of that state collectively paid $100 million in federal taxes. Then, because you're a citizen of this state, what the state could do is, they could either just apply it directly to state taxes and make the state taxes a lot less. But if you really wanted to collect the same level of state tax and discourage federal government activity, what you could do is actually take that $10 million and give it back in proportion to the people that paid federal tax. So basically, whoever paid federal tax, they would get 10% off their federal taxes, because we now have this additional money that came from these programs, and it would serve to essentially make it easier for people and reduce the burden, right? So that citizens of that state who implemented this return to federalism plan would not actually need to contribute as much of their money towards, whatever the federal government is doing in other states. So it doesn't impact them as much. So the state is kind of shielding their citizens from the kind of federal bureaucracy, where the government is essentially trying to get everyone to fund programs that not everyone might agree with at a federal level. So this noticeably doesn't actually contain any political proposals about particular issues. It's more of an economic proposal that would set up the right incentives. I'm very curious to see how this is going to be received and what people think of it, because it would be really cool, in my opinion, if our country moved back towards a system of federalism where we got started and where we made so much progress. Thank you for taking the time, and I look forward to your feedback. This has been Ty Everett.